We often talk about the United States, as this single unified country,
Right.
one nation.
Right, under one flag.
But when you actually look closer, the differences between states are just incredible, aren't they? I mean, think about California versus Mississippi.
It's a stark contrast. And what's really striking is how fundamental these differences are. We're not just talking small quirks.
No, exactly. It's about law, health, wealth, education, the real core stuff. And that's what we're going to dig into today.
We've been looking at this analysis, American disparities, a state-by-state analysis.
Yeah, a really deep resource. And our mission here is to kind of unpack why states are so different in these surprising ways.
We want to get beyond just listing the differences and actually understand the roots. What's driving these variations? What does it tell us?
Prepare for some moments, hopefully.
Yeah.
We'll touch on the Constitution, history, demographics, how they all weave together.
It's a complex picture.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Why do U.S. states differ so much? What's the foundation?
Well, the report points right back to the structure of government itself, federalism.
Federalism, okay.
It's this core idea of dual sovereignty. Basically, the federal government has its specific powers, but the states keep a whole lot of authority too.
And so there's a division of labor, sort of.
Yeah.
Federal law is supreme if there's a conflict, right? Supremacy clause.
That's the one. But the 10th Amendment is key here too. It says any powers not explicitly given to the feds or denied to the states are reserved for the states.
And that's a lot of power, I imagine. Like, what kind of things fall under state control?
A huge amount, really. They have what are called police powers. It sounds specific, but it's actually very broad.
Police powers,
Ah,
like law enforcement.
that's part of it, but it's much broader. Think health, safety, welfare, morals. So education standards, public health rules, criminal law, business regulation, mostly state-level decisions.
Wow, okay. So the system's almost designed for states to go their own ways.
Exactly. It encourages variation. It leads to that famous phrase, laboratories of democracy.
Ugh. Justice Brandeis. The idea that states can try out different policies without, risking the whole country on one experiment.
Precisely. And you see it everywhere. Take insurance, for example. There's a national group, the NAIC, that creates model laws.
Okay.
But each state decides whether to adopt those models, tweak them, or ignore them completely. So you end up with 50 different sets of insurance rules.
So it's not just different policies, but sometimes fundamentally different levels of protection or service depending on where you live.
Absolutely. But the federal government isn't completely uninvolved in state matters.
Right, they have the power of the purse, don't they? Funding often comes with strings attached.
That's a major tool, the spending clause. Congress can offer money to states, but only if they agree to certain conditions or policies.
Like with Medicaid expansion under the ACA, that was a big one.
The perfect example. The federal government offered funding, but states had to choose whether to expand their Medicaid programs to cover more low-income adults.
And the Commerce Clause also gives the federal government some reach into state affairs.
It does, regulating interstate commerce. That's been interpreted pretty broadly over time, but there are limits. The Supreme Court has said the feds can't just commandeer state governments and force them to enforce federal laws. That's the anti-commandeering doctrine.
So this whole structure, state autonomy, balanced with some federal influence, directly creates these disparities we're talking about.
It's a direct line. That choice on Medicaid expansion, it created huge differences in uninsured rates and healthcare access between expansion and non-expansion states. You see the same thing with schools.
How so?
K-12 education funding. It relies so heavily on local property taxes in most states.
So wealthier areas can raise more money for their schools than poorer areas.
Exactly, leading to significant inequities in resources and opportunities, not just across states, but even within the same state.
It's pretty sobering. The quality of your kid's education or your access to health care can depend so much on your zip code or state lines.
It really can. And it's not just the legal structure. History plays an enormous role, too.
States didn't just appear out of nowhere with the Constitution. They had their own histories leading up to that and continuing after.
Absolutely not. The analysis stresses these unique historical paths. Think about the original colonies. There were distinct cultural starting points.
Right. You had New England, kind of Puritan, focused on community, education, small farms, trade.
Then the Midland colonies, more diverse from the start, Quakers in Pennsylvania, more tolerance, agriculture, but also commerce.
And the South, fundamentally shaped by the plantation economy, cash crops like tobacco and cotton, And tragically, the institution of slavery and a very hierarchical society.
And these weren't just coastal bubbles. As people moved west, they took these cultural blueprints with them.
So the way new states were settled and developed was influenced by where the settlers came from.
Definitely. Plus, westward expansion itself involved acquiring vast territories, conflicts with Native American nations, and huge political battles, especially over whether new territories would allow slavery.
That fight over slavery, it dominated everything for decades and really forged these deep regional identities.
It absolutely did, and it culminated in the Civil War, which, while preserving the Union and ending slavery, left deep, deep scars, particularly in the South.
The economic recovery in the South was incredibly slow, right? And compounded by Jim Crow laws.
Yes, decades of slow recovery and systemic racial discrimination severely limited opportunities for Black Americans and contributed to persistent poverty and inequality that we still see echoes of today.
It created these legacies, these disparities in education, health, economic opportunity that are hard to shake.
Exactly. Then came waves of industrialization, mostly in the North and Midwest, attracting European immigrants, the rise of the manufacturing belt.
And the Great Migration, with African Americans moving from the rural South to northern and western cities, changing the demographics there too.
Huge societal shifts, followed later by deindustrialization in the Rust Belt and the rise of the Sun Belt, the growth of service and tech economies. Each state navigated these transformations differently.
The report uses the term path dependencies. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's the idea that choices made early on or historical events can kind of lock a place into a certain trajectory. It makes it harder to change course later.
Like New England's early focus on education, maybe setting it up for success in the knowledge economy later on.
That's a potential example, yes. Conversely, the Deep South's reliance on an agricultural economy built on enslaved labor created challenges for diversifying its economy and investing in widespread education, effects that lingered for generations.
So the past isn't really past. It's still shaping the present in very real ways.
Very much so.
Okay, Constitution, history. What about the people living in the States today? How do demographics drive these differences?
Demographics are huge. Things like the age breakdown of the population, the racial and ethnic mix, the urban versus rural split, and who's moving in or out. They all shape state priorities and policies.
Okay, take age. How does that play out?
Well, a state like Utah, which typically has a younger population, lots of kids, they're naturally going to be focused on funding K-12 schools.
Whereas Florida or Maine, with large populations of retirees.
Exactly. Their focus shifts more towards healthcare, long-term care facilities, services for seniors. And nationwide, the population is aging, putting pressure on state budgets everywhere. Think Medicaid costs for nursing homes, state employee pensions.
Makes sense. What about racial and ethnic diversity? That varies a lot by state, too.
Immensely. States like California, Texas, New York, Florida are incredibly diverse and becoming more so. Compare that to states like Vermont or Maine, which are much more homogenous.
And diverse states need different things.
They often face different policy demands. Things like providing services in multiple languages, ensuring healthcare is culturally competent, addressing disparities in education for different groups, integrating immigrants. California is a good example of a state grappling with these policy needs on a large scale.
What about the less diverse states? Do they face challenges related to that?
They might struggle to attract a diverse workforce, which can be important for economic growth in certain sectors. And even in more homogeneous states, meeting the needs of smaller minority groups is still crucial for equity. We see persistent racial and ethnic gaps in health, income, education, pretty much everywhere, requiring targeted efforts.
And the urban-rural divide. That feels like a classic American split.
It really is. Highly urbanized states, think New Jersey or Massachusetts, they wrestle with issues of density, public transit, affordable housing crunches, concentrated urban poverty.
While states with vast rural areas, Wyoming, Montana, Alaska.
Their challenges are different, providing basic infrastructure like roads and broadband over huge distances, ensuring access to healthcare or even grocery stores in remote areas. Rural areas often struggle with aging populations, lack of economic diversification, and doctor shortages.
And people moving between states, migration must shake things up too.
Absolutely. States like Florida, Texas, Arizona have seen a lot of in-migration. That can boost the labor force and tax base, which sounds good. But it strains infrastructure, roads, schools, water supplies. You need to build fast. On the flip side, states in parts of the Rust Belt or Great Plains might see people leaving or slow growth.
Which means a potentially shrinking workforce. fewer taxpayers.
Right. Maybe an older population left behind, making it harder to fund services. And federal immigration policies obviously have a huge impact on many states, affecting workforce, schools, social services.
So it all connects. Demographics influence what people need and want from their state government. That shapes policy. Policy affects the state's budget and economy, and that can influence who decides to move in or out.
It's a constant dynamic interplay. Age structure shifts demand between schools and elder care. Diversity pushes states to adapt policies for equity. The urban-rural split demands different kinds of infrastructure investment. It's always evolving.
Let's pivot then to the economy itself. Huge variations there, obviously.
Massive differences. Let's start with the basics, like gross domestic product or GDP, the total economic output.
California, Texas, New York, Florida, the giants, right?
Those are the biggest economies overall, yes. But then you have states like Vermont, Wyoming, Alaska with much smaller total GDP.
But population size matters. What about GDP per person?
That changes the picture a bit. D.C., New York, Massachusetts often come out near the top in GDP per capita. North Dakota and Alaska also rank high, often due to natural resources. And states like Mississippi, Arkansas, West Virginia tend to be at the lower end per person.
And growth rates. Are some state economies just growing faster than others?
Yeah, growth isn't uniform. In the early 2020s, Florida, Idaho, Tennessee saw strong, real GDP growth. More recently, North Dakota's energy sector boosted its numbers. Arkansas had a strong end to 2024. It fluctuates based on national trends and what's happening in specific state industries.
Okay, let's talk income. Median household income, what does that tell us?
That gives you a sense of the typical household's earnings. Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Utah often lead there.
And at the other end?
Mississippi, West Virginia, Louisiana, Arkansas consistently have lower median household incomes. Per capita, personal income per person shows a similar pattern. D.C., Massachusetts, Connecticut high, Mississippi, West Virginia, Alabama low.
It really paints a picture of where economic prosperity is concentrated. What drives these big differences? The dominant industries in each state must be key.
Absolutely critical. In many large states like California and Illinois, professional and business services are huge drivers.
What about manufacturing? We hear a lot about its decline, but it's still important, right?
Very important, especially in the Midwest and Southeast. About 12 states list it as their top contributing sector to GDP. Nationally, it's still a significant chunk of the economy and employment. California, Texas, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois employ the most manufacturing workers, and it has a strong multiplier effect.
Meaning manufacturing jobs support other jobs in the supply chain, services, etc.
Exactly. Then you have real estate as a major sector in many states. Government is dominant in D.C., obviously, and states with large military bases or federal facilities.
And some states are really defined by specific industries.
Right. Mining, oil, and gas in places like North Dakota, West Virginia, Wyoming. The information sector tech is huge in Washington state, and tourism and entertainment drive Nevada's economy.
Does relying heavily on one sector make a state vulnerable, like North Dakota with oil prices?
It definitely can. Volatility in commodity prices creates booms and busts. That's why economic diversification is so important for stability. States like Massachusetts or California, with broader mixes of industries, tech, finance, education, healthcare, tend to weather economic downturns better.
So state governments actively try to diversify their economies.
Good ones do, yes. Developing strategies to attract different kinds of businesses and support innovation is crucial for long-term resilience.
Okay, so we see wealth is created unevenly. How is it distributed? Let's talk poverty and inequality.
This is where the picture gets even more complex. Poverty rates, for instance, vary dramatically.
We mentioned Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, New Mexico, West Virginia tend to have higher rates.
Consistently among the highest, based on the official measure over several years. At the other end, you often find New Hampshire, Maryland, Utah, Hawaii with the lowest rates.
But there's another way to measure poverty, right? The supplemental poverty measure.
Yes, the SPM. It's important because it accounts for the cost of living housing, especially, and also the impact of government assistance programs like food stamps or tax credits.
So it might show a different picture.
It can. For example, California's official poverty rate might not seem the absolute highest, but its SPM rate is often very high because housing costs are astronomical, even with assistance programs factored in. Conversely, some states might look better under the SPM if they have lower costs of living and strong safety nets.
What drives high poverty in those states where it's persistent?
It's usually a mix of things. Economies dominated by low-wage jobs, limited access to quality education or job training, lack of affordable housing, higher unemployment, sometimes poor health outcomes that limit work. It's often interconnected.
And income inequality. How unequal are the states internally?
We usually look at the Gini coefficient for that. Higher number means more inequality.
And where is inequality highest?
Typically, states like New York, D.C., Connecticut, Massachusetts, California, and also Louisiana show up with higher Gini coefficients, more unequal distributions of income.
And lowest?
States like Utah, Idaho, Alaska, Wyoming often have lower Gini coefficients, suggesting income is distributed somewhat more evenly. And the national trend for decades has been towards increasing inequality overall.
The report also mentions opportunity gaps. That sounds like it's about more than just money.
It is. It's about who gets ahead, who gets into leadership positions, and there are stark racial and gender disparities here.
Like what?
Well, data shows in states like Mississippi or South Carolina, for example, white workers are vastly more likely to be in executive roles compared to workers of color. Nationally, Black and Latina women are significantly underrepresented in leadership pretty much everywhere.
So even beyond income, access to power and influence is unequal.
And interestingly, the analysis suggests the racial opportunity gap in getting into those top jobs is often wider than the gender gap in every single state.
Wow. It seems like poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, they're all tangled up with a state's economic structure and its history.
Absolutely. Low-wage economies, the long shadow of racial discrimination, limiting mobility, unequal access to good schools, it all feeds into these persistent gaps. Addressing them requires thinking way beyond just welfare programs.
Let's shift to something often discussed. A state's business climate. What does that really mean? Taxes and regulations seem central.
They're definitely part of the conversation. State tax policies, sales tax rates, corporate income tax rates, specific rules like throwback provisions, they can influence business decisions.
Does research show higher taxes hurt business growth?
It's debated. Some studies suggest a potential negative link between certain taxes and small business growth. But for large corporations, it's often more complicated.
How so?
Big companies have lawyers and accountants to navigate complex tax codes. They can shift income between states, negotiate for special tax incentives, so the headline tax rate might not reflect what they actually pay. Incentives often benefit new or relocating firms more than existing ones.
Okay, so taxes are one piece. What about regulations?
Big variations there, too. Federal regulations set a floor, but states can go further. Think environmental rules. California is famous for having stricter emission standards than the federal government.
And labor laws.
Huge differences. Minimum wage is the obvious one. Many states are way above the federal, $7.25. But also workplace safety rules. Some states run their own OSHA-like programs, laws around unions, requirements for paid sick leave or family leave. It's a patchwork.
So calling a state business-friendly just based on low taxes might be too simplistic?
Definitely. You have to look at the effective tax burden, how complex the rules are, what kind of workforce is available, the quality of infrastructure. Sometimes higher taxes pay for better schools and roads, which businesses also need.
It's a trade-off then. Attracting business versus having enough revenue for public services that support the economy and quality of life.
Exactly that balance. You need revenue for education, infrastructure, public safety, all things that contribute to a positive business climate in the long run.
Okay, we've talked about the economy. Let's get into how states actually pay for everything. The fiscal frameworks, the tax systems.
Right, how they raise the money. And again, huge diversity here. Let's start with individual income taxes.
Some states don't have one at all, right?
8 states have no broad-based personal income tax. Washington state taxes capital gains, but not wages. The rest, 41 states plus D.C., tax wage income.
And among those that do, the systems differ.
Big time. You have flat tax states, about 14 now, where everyone pays the same rate regardless of income. Then you have graduated rate states, the majority, where the rate increases as income goes up.
More progressive, in theory.
Yes. And even among graduated systems, the complexity varies wildly. Hawaii has 12 different tax brackets. Others might only have 2 or 3. Top rates range from just 2.5% in a couple of states to over 13% in California.
Wow. And they differ in how they treat married couples. Adjust for inflation.
All of that, plus how closely they follow federal definitions of income. And there's been a recent trend. Something like 28 states have cut income tax rates since 2021.
Okay, income tax is one pillar. What about property taxes?
Crucial, especially for local governments. Nationally, Property taxes are the main source of funding for K-12 schools, plus local roads, police, fire departments. They make up about 70% of local tax collections.
But the rates people pay vary a lot.
Hugely. Effective property tax rates, what people actually pay as a percentage of their home's value, can be 3 or 4 times higher in states like Illinois or New Jersey compared to states like Hawaii or Alabama. And even within a state, your local town or county sets its own rate, so it varies block by block sometimes.
Then there's sales tax.
The third major leg. Levied at the state level, often with local add-ons, 5 states have no statewide sales tax at all. Delaware, Montana, New Hampshire, Oregon. Alaska lets localities charge them, but has no state sales tax.
And where they exist, the rates and what's taxed differ?
Yep. California has a high state rate. Texas has no income tax, so it relies more heavily on sales tax, with a moderately high rate and a fairly broad base of taxable goods and services. Big arguments always happen over whether to tax things like groceries, prescription drugs, or services like haircuts or legal advice.
So if you add it all up, income, property, sales, other taxes, how does the total tax burden compare across states?
There are different ways to measure it. One common way is total state and local taxes as a percentage of the state's total personal income.
And who's highest and lowest there?
Studies often put states like Hawaii, New York, and Vermont near the top for overall tax burden relative to income. Alaska, New Hampshire, Florida, Tennessee often rank among the lowest.
Does that directly translate to how much tax revenue the state collects per person?
Not always perfectly, but there's a correlation. Tax collections per capita tend to be higher in states like North Dakota, boosted by oil taxes, Hawaii, and Vermont. Lower in places like New Hampshire, Missouri, Texas. It reflects both the tax rates and the scope of government services provided.
Which brings us to tax competitiveness. What does that usually mean?
Groups like the Tax Foundation rank states on this, often favoring systems that are simple, neutral, transparent, and stable, generally meaning lower rates on broader bases. They argue this is better for economic growth.
But it's complicated, right? Low taxes might mean fewer services.
Exactly. A state might be ranked as highly competitive or tax-friendly, but that could mean less funding for schools, roads, parks, or social programs. High-tax states often provide more extensive public services.
So you, as a resident, have to weigh the tax bill against the value you feel you're getting in return. And who bears the burden matters, too. Sales taxes tend to hit lower-income folks harder than progressive income taxes.
Precisely. There are always trade-offs and equity considerations embedded in any state's tax structure.
Okay, let's shift gears to some of the most fundamental aspects of life. Health, education, and housing. How do states measure up here, starting with health?
Yeah, the disparities are really stark when you look at health outcomes. The Commonwealth Fund does a great annual scorecard on state health system performance.
And who typically comes out on top?
Consistently, states like Massachusetts, Hawaii, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Vermont tend to rank highest overall.
And at the bottom.
States in the South and Southwest often rank lower: Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma, West Virginia, Mississippi.
What kind of factors are they looking at?
Things like access to care, quality of care, costs, health outcomes like avoidable deaths, and health equity. And sadly, avoidable deaths increased everywhere between 2019 and 2021. But the jump was much sharper in some states: Arizona, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Mexico, Texas than others.
Do lifestyle and environment play a role in state differences?
Absolutely. Hawaii benefits from things like low obesity rates and less air pollution, relatively speaking. States like Kentucky and West Virginia often struggle with higher rates of smoking, obesity, and related chronic diseases.
What about just being able to get care when you need it and afford it?
That's another key dimension. The Commonwealth Fund ranks Massachusetts, Hawaii, Rhode Island highly on access and affordability. Texas, Oklahoma, Wyoming tend to score lower.
Is that linked to state policies like Medicaid?
Very closely linked. A state's demographics, poverty rates, unemployment, disability rates affect demand for Medicaid. But the state's policy choices about who's eligible for Medicaid and how generous the benefits are have a huge impact on access, especially for low-income populations.
So some states are more vulnerable if federal Medicaid funding changes.
Definitely. States with high demand due to demographics like New Mexico or Kentucky, or states with high healthcare costs or barriers to access like Alaska or West Virginia, are particularly sensitive to federal funding levels.
And the most basic measure of access is just having health insurance. How do uninsured rates compare?
Well, the good news is the national uninsured rate has been relatively low recently, around 9.5% for working-age adults in 2023, but state variation is still huge.
Massachusetts and D.C. are lowest.
consistently the lowest, often under 5%. Texas is consistently the highest, sometimes close to 20% uninsured among the under 65 population.
Wow, that's a massive difference. And the type of coverage varies too. Employer plans, Medicaid, marketplace.
Yes. Utah and North Dakota have high rates of employer coverage. New Mexico and Louisiana rely heavily on Medicaid CHEP. Florida and North Dakota have relatively high shares getting coverage through the ACA marketplaces. It reflects differences in job markets, income levels, and state policy choices.
Do states regulate their insurance markets differently?
They do. Some run their own ACA marketplaces, state-based marketplaces, or SBMs. Others use the federal platform. They can set different rules about enrollment periods, network adequacy, consumer protections. We mentioned the NAIC model laws earlier. States adopt and adapt those differently. They also tackle emerging issues like rules around prescription drug copay assistance programs.
But it sounds like the single biggest policy driver of coverage differences is Medicaid expansion.
Overwhelmingly, yes. States that expanded Medicaid under the ACA saw significant drops in their uninsured rates, improved access to care, better financial protection for residents, and it even helped keep rural hospitals afloat.
And non-expansion states.
They generally have higher uninsured rates, particularly among low-income adults who fall into a coverage gap, earning too much for traditional Medicaid, but not enough to get subsidies on the marketplace. Texas and Florida are the largest non-expansion states. This policy divergence is arguably the primary reason for the huge gaps in insurance coverage and access we see today.
It's a powerful example of state choices having life or death consequences. Okay, let's turn to education, from kindergarten to college.
Another area with major state-level differences, especially in funding. For K-12 public schools, it's mostly state and local money.
What's the typical split?
Nationally, it's been roughly 44–46% state funding, 43–44% local funding, and maybe 10–11% federal funding, although the federal share jumped temporarily due to pandemic aid.
But that mix varies by state.
Oh, yeah. Some states like Mississippi and South Dakota rely more heavily on federal dollars. Others like New York and New Jersey get a smaller share from the feds. And then the state versus local split differs dramatically. Hawaii is unique. It's almost entirely state-funded. Vermont also relies heavily on state funds, but New Hampshire, Nebraska, Connecticut depend much more on local funding.
And local funding usually means property taxes, right?
Yeah.
Which leads back to those equity issues we discussed.
Exactly. Over 80% of local school funding nationally comes from property taxes. Wealthier districts can raise more money at lower tax rates than poorer districts, creating resource gaps.
How does this translate into school quality and student outcomes?
Well, rankings vary depending on methodology, but states like Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey often appear near the top in overall school quality rankings.
And standardized tests, like the NAEP, the Nation's Report Card.
NAEP scores show clear state differences. For 8th grade math in 2022, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Jersey were among the highest performers. Alabama, Louisiana, New Mexico among the lowest. 4th grade reading scores also varied, with Massachusetts and Florida doing well, New Mexico and Alaska lower. And worryingly, scores declined in most states compared to 2019. Science scores show similar patterns.
High school graduation rates differ too.
Yes, states like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Vermont often report higher graduation rates.
Okay, what about higher education? How do states fund their colleges and universities?
State funding is still critical, especially for public 2-year community colleges, where it can be around half their revenue. For 4-year publics, state appropriations are a smaller share, maybe under 20% on average, with tuition making up more.
Is the funding approach changing?
There's been a big shift towards performance-based funding in many states, over 30 by 2020. A portion of state money is tied to outcomes like graduation rates, degree completion in high-demand fields, serving underrepresented students.
What are the big priorities for states in higher ed right now?
According to state higher education officers, priorities include securing adequate state funding overall, aligning programs with workforce needs, funding student financial aid, demonstrating the value of college to a skeptical public, and improving completion rates. Falling enrollment is a major concern, too.
It seems like the K-12 funding inequities driven by property taxes are a huge challenge. Federal Title I funding helps, but doesn't fully close the gap.
It doesn't. Many argue states need to overhaul their funding formulas to be more equitable. And with higher ed performance funding, it needs careful design so it doesn't unintentionally punish colleges that serve more disadvantaged students who might face more barriers to completion.
All right, let's talk about a basic need, housing. Affordability seems like a crisis everywhere, but how does it vary?
The crisis is real, but it manifests differently. Nationally, housing cost burden, spending over 30% of income on housing, is high. Almost a quarter of homeowners were cost burdened in 2023.
And renters.
Even worse. A record 50% of renters nationally were cost-burdened in 2022, and for the lowest-income renters, it's astronomical. Over 80% are cost-burdened, and most of those severely so, spending over half their income on rent.
Why is it so bad for renters?
A big factor is the shrinking supply of low-cost rental units. Millions of units renting for under $600 a month disappeared between 2012 and 2022. Rents have risen much faster than incomes for many people.
And home prices themselves vary wildly.
Right. Dramatically. Median home prices in places like Hawaii, D.C., and California are often multiple times higher than in states like Iowa, Oklahoma, Ohio, or West Virginia and Mississippi, which tend to be the lowest.
This must connect to homelessness rates.
There's definitely a correlation, especially between high rents and homelessness. The official point-in-time counts show the highest rates of homelessness per capita in Hawaii, D.C., New York, and Vermont. Mississippi has the lowest rate.
But the number of people experiencing homelessness is highest in the big population centers.
Right. California and New York have the largest absolute numbers. Cities like NYC and LA face huge challenges: rising costs, the end of pandemic relief, substance abuse, mental health issues are all contributing factors. And there's variation in unsheltered homelessness, too much higher in California than in New York, for instance, partly due to climate, but also policy differences like right to shelter laws.
So the affordability crisis hits differently. High-cost coastal states have one set of problems. Lower-income states might have different pressures even with lower prices.
Exactly. Policy responses need to be tailored. High-cost areas might focus on boosting supply or rent stabilization. Lower-income areas might need more economic development alongside targeted rental assistance. And the needs for emergency shelter versus permanent supportive housing differ too.
Okay, finally, let's look at broader social dimensions. Well-being, care, legal protections, things beyond just economics or basic services.
This covers a lot, like social support systems. Take paid family leave. Is it available? Who pays for it?
And the answer varies by state.
Big time. Only about 13 states plus D.C. currently mandate paid family and medical leave, usually funded through payroll taxes like unemployment insurance. A few others facilitate voluntary private plans. Most states rely just on the federal FMLA, which only provides unpaid leave and doesn't cover everyone.
Minimum wage is another obvious one.
Huge variation. Over 30 states have minimums higher than the federal $7.25 an hour. 20 states are still at $7.25 or have no state minimum. D.C., Washington State, California have the highest rates. Many states now index their minimum wage to inflation, so it rises automatically. This directly impacts low-wage workers' earnings.
What about the criminal justice system? States run their own courts, prisons.
Yes, leading to significant differences. Sentencing laws have swung back and forth, historically indeterminate versus determinate sentences. The tough-on-crime era with mandatory minimums and 3 strikes laws. Now, many states are reconsidering those policies to reduce incarceration rates and address racial disparities, but the pace and scope of reform vary hugely.
Drug laws are a prime example of divergence, too.
Especially marijuana. It's still illegal federally, a Schedule I drug, but a majority of states have legalized it for medical use and a growing number for recreational use. This creates conflicts and massive differences in arrests, convictions, state tax revenue,
And things like bail reform or parole practices.
also vary widely. Different approaches to pretrial detention, use of risk assessment tools, conditions for parole and probation, all impacting jail populations and potentially recidivism rates.
States are also leading on climate policy in some ways, right? Renewable energy standards.
Yes, around 30 states plus D.C. have mandatory renewable portfolio standards, RPS, or clean energy standards, CES, requiring utilities to get a certain percentage of their power from clean sources by a certain date. About 15 states plus D.C. have goals of 100% clean or renewable energy, typically aiming for dates between 2030 and 2050. The specifics vary a lot.
It seems like policy ideas, paid leave, minimum wage, renewables often start in a few states and then spread.
That's a common pattern, policy diffusion. Often starts in more progressive states, but political polarization definitely affects how widely and quickly ideas spread now. You end up with this patchwork quilt of rights, protections, and standards depending entirely on which state you live in.
Let's touch on care for specific groups, children and the elderly. Childcare seems like a constant struggle for families.
It is. Supply hasn't kept up with demand in many places, especially for family childcare homes. And the cost is just staggering.
How much are we talking?
The national average for center-based care was over $13,000 a year in 2024. That's more than 10% of a typical married couple's income, and over a third of a single parent's income, way above the federal affordability benchmark. For 2 kids, the cost exceeds the median mortgage payment in almost all states, and median rent in basically every state. And prices have risen faster than overall inflation recently.
Do state policies make a difference? Subsidies, quality rules.
They do. States used federal pandemic relief funds differently, and they vary in their regular subsidy levels, reimbursement rates for providers, and quality rating systems. And sadly, overall child well-being indicators, like those from the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Kids Count report, show persistent gaps. While child poverty has improved slightly, preschool enrollment is low, and reading proficiency among 4th graders actually worsened recently. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Utah tend to rank high overall. New Mexico, Mississippi, Louisiana low.
And what about care for the elderly, long-term services and supports?
Another area of significant state variation. AARP produces a scorecard on this. Minnesota, Washington State, D.C. often rank high overall. Alabama, West Virginia tend to rank lower. They look at affordability, access, choice of settings, home versus institution, quality, support for family caregivers, and community integration. Worryingly, access to things like adult day services and home health aides has actually declined in many states recently.
It really drives home the main point, doesn't it? The idea of a single United States experience is almost misleading when you look this closely.
It really is. These state-level disparities are huge. They cut across almost every aspect of life, and as we've seen, they're deeply woven into history, demographics, economic structures, and deliberate policy choices.
Think about it. Your chances of having health insurance, the resources in your child's school, the value of your home, your minimum wage, whether you get paid leave, it can all hinge on which side of a state line you live on.
It makes you fundamentally question what that union means in practice for people's day-to-day lives and opportunities.
Well, our goal was to give you a quick but thorough understanding of these deep divides, drawing from that American disparities analysis. Hopefully, we've delivered some of those aha moments.
And it leaves us with some big questions to ponder, doesn't it? How do these deep, persistent differences between states affect the country's overall cohesion and strength? Is there a role or even a responsibility for the federal government to try and bridge some of these gaps while still respecting the state's constitutional roles?
Those are definitely questions worth thinking more about. We really encourage you to keep exploring this data and the complex reasons behind these state-level realities. Thanks so much for taking this deep dive with us today.
This is DigitView.